Sergey Viktorovich, the first question is for you. How can you comment on the Ukrainian demands, which the Guardian newspaper mentioned, to obtain permission to use Storm Shadow missiles to strike Moscow and St. Petersburg in order to force Moscow to negotiate? Well, this is blackmail. This is an attempt to pretend that the West wants to avoid excessive escalation. In fact, this is deceit. The West does not want to avoid escalation. Speaking in Russian, the West is pushing for it. And it seems to me that this is already obvious to everyone. I have already cited the statement of Mr. Kirby, the representative of the National Security Advisor. As I understand it, for strategic communications, a couple of months ago he said that escalation is dangerous because it is extremely undesirable to bring things to a world war, since Europe will suffer because of it. He recently repeated this again. Americans clearly associate talk about a World War III as something that, God forbid, if it is realized, can affect only Europe. This is a very telling moment, reflecting the mentality of American planners, geopolitical strategists, who are convinced that they will survive this bypassing it. And in this situation, it is probably very important to understand that we have our own doctrine, including the doctrine of using nuclear weapons. By the way, it is currently being clarified, and American officials are very well aware of it, but this is breaking through in Freudian fashion. You know that supposedly the World War III is bad because they do not want Europe to suffer. This is the entire American mentality. This is the mentality of the master, who sits on the other side, who is confident in his safety, that not only Ukrainians will do the dirty work and die for him, but, as it turns out, now also Europeans. We have long been hearing these speculations about allowing the use of not only Storm Shadow, but also American long-range missiles. By the way, some anonymous source in Washington said that such work is being done, that Ukraine's request is being viewed in a generally positive light. I guess I won't add anything more here. And our president has already said everything. And now we confirm once again that this is playing with fire. And they are like little children playing with matches. This is a very dangerous thing for grown men and women who are entrusted with nuclear weapons in one or another Western country. Sergey Viktorovich, how do you assess the situation with the detention of Telegram founder Pavel Durov in France? Was there any reaction from Paris to the Russian note? And is the Russian Foreign Ministry considering refusing to use the platform if Durov cooperates with the French investigation? In your opinion, how will the situation with Durov's detention affect bilateral relations between Moscow and Paris? Thank you. Well, I'll start from the end. Relations between Moscow and Paris are at their lowest point, including because of the position that Paris takes on freedom of speech, freedom of dissemination of information, and in general on respect for the profession of journalist. Long before the current events, many years ago, when the Ukrainian crisis had not yet entered the hot phase, we faced a problem due to the fact that the Élysée Palace refused to accredit RT and Sputnik. We repeatedly contacted the relevant services of the Élysée Palace. We conveyed our concerns to Macron's assistants. Their answer was adamant that RT and Sputnik are not mass media, but state propaganda tools. This is only one characteristic of the attitude of our French colleagues to freedom of speech, to the mass media. Moreover, in 1990, when it seemed to everyone, in the words of Francis Fukuyama, that the end of history had come, in the OSCE, to the general jubilation in Paris, on the initiative of France, A special declaration was approved with a solemn promise to ensure 100% free access to any information, both on its territory and to the information that comes from the territory of other OSCE member states. And while the Soviet Union was in a state of disintegration, and while the Russian Federation was in the state it was in at the beginning and in the mid-1990s, the West insisted that this sacred obligation be observed, of course, first of all by our country, then, when we return to our own history, to our national identity, to our roots, when we began to promote our own interests in the international arena, the West began to shirk this obligation. Look, now in the OSCE we are the only ones who remind us of this obligation to ensure access to information in our countries and abroad. All the others have adopted many laws, many special instructions, including the instruction that they accuse Pavel Durov of violating, although some Belgian company that regulates the application of this EU law denies that it has ever complained about anyone. There is a lot of absurdity there. Therefore, we have long known about France's reaction to freedom of speech. Our relations with Paris, as I have already said, are worse than ever, and this is not our fault. In both NATO and the European Union, President Macron is among the leaders in tightening policy towards Russia and increasing military aid to Ukraine and ensuring the victory of the Zelensky regime on the battlefield. Well, you see it, in general. There is nothing to add here. As for our specific actions, our diplomatic note is under consideration. We are awaiting a response to this note. You probably also know that the United Arab Emirates is also dealing with the same issue. They also have a group of lawyers who have asked for immediate access to Pavel Durov. As for the use of this platform, it is very convenient. It is truly protected. At least, if anyone had any doubts about this, now that they obviously took Durov on someone's advice and are threatening him with terrible punishment, apparently hoping to gain access to encryption codes. Now the actions of the French have proven that Telegram is indeed a reliable and popular social network. We also had questions about Telegram in previous years, but we were talking exclusively about legal cases that were considered in accordance with the law, which were resolved. We have never discussed any attempts to restrict the freedom of Pavel Durov or his team. But Pavel Durov has personally said more than once that he will not make any compromises regarding the principles on which Telegram is based. Good afternoon. Valentina Schwartzman, RBC. Earlier, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in an interview with Indian media that he would like to hold the next second summit on a peaceful settlement around Ukraine in one of the countries of the Global South. Would Russia take part in such an event if it were really held in the countries of the Global South? Thank you very much. Next means the one that continues some initiative. There is only one initiative. It began as the Copenhagen format. Then it was transformed into the Bergenstock Conference. But the essence of all these processes is the absolutely hopeless, dead-end so-called peace formula that Zelensky put forward. Therefore, everything that is in the series of events promoting this formula is an uncontested outcome. Of course, only dreamers in Ukraine, in Kiev, in the West can consider this as something that Russia will fall for. They are talking about a game. They want to put us in a situation where we will fall for something that suits Zelensky. We can talk, as our president has repeatedly said, about negotiations in which no one puts forward any ultimatums to anyone. This was the case in February 2014, when Yanukovych, then the president of Ukraine, agreed with the opposition under the guarantee of France, Germany and Poland that they would create a government of national unity and hold national elections. The next morning, this honest agreement was destroyed by the opposition at the instigation of the United States and other Western countries, which immediately recognized the results of this bloody unconstitutional coup d'etat. If they had fulfilled this agreement, Ukraine would now be within the 1991 borders, including Crimea. Well, then there was the agreement in Minsk in February 2015. Approved by the Security Council, as Poroshenko, Merkel, and then French President Hollande admitted. None of them were going to implement this decision of the UN Security Council. Moreover, this is the decision approving the document that they signed. They needed to gain time. Then there were also honest negotiations in Minsk, where everyone sat down and for 17 hours the presidents, the chancellor discussed, negotiated and agreed on everything. This was a balance of interests, if you like. But they did not want to implement this either. Now it is clear why. Just as in Istanbul they did not want to implement the agreement that was initialed. The reason for this is that they did not need an honest agreement. Neither the Putschists in February 2014, nor Poroshenko in February 2015, nor Zelensky in April 2022. They only needed a piece of paper that outlined an ultimatum. After all, not all people in Ukraine are so naive. Of course, they understood that an ultimatum in our time, especially to Russia, is a completely meaningless thing. But they had one hope. The Anglo-Saxons and all sorts of Borrells in Brussels, Ursula von der Leyen, Macrons from Paris, unanimously told them that Ukraine must defeat Russia on the battlefield. And they are doing everything to make this happen. That is, the West is taking Ukraine away from normal human negotiations based on generally accepted principles. And the West is doing everything to ensure that Ukraine continues the escalation, as they call it, in the hope. Now more and more suspicions are emerging on this account that we will have a breakdown, that we will do something that will allow the West, as they believe, to change the chessboard. They will not succeed. We will achieve our goals. And we will achieve our goals in the way that our president said, which will best meet the interests of, firstly, the savings of our people, and secondly, the protection of those people whom the regime in Kiev declared terrorists, whom they deprived of basic rights, including the right to their religion, faith, language, and much more. Therefore, they will not succeed in provoking us. And all these Bergenstocks and so-called peace formulas, well, that's from the evil one. This is not about Zelensky. If the West is really interested in normalizing the situation in Europe, from which the Europeans themselves are already groaning and suffering, then we must sit down at the negotiating table calmly, without any papers in hand called the Zelensky formula, and begin to talk honestly. Our president confirmed that we were ready for this. Now he gave 3 examples when we supported such negotiations, but now that they have already lied 3 times. Who will believe them now? But we will see. They must draw conclusions.